Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello, everyone, and it's a real privilege to be opening this session with a few words about this book, Race for Tomorrow, and some of the extraordinary human stories that I was able to include in it. So, my background is as a foreign correspondent for the Financial Times, working in South Africa, South Korea, and India. And it was during my time as a foreign correspondent that I was struck by how the climate crisis and the changes that it has sent cascading through the world economy is simply the biggest story of our century, the biggest story for any journalist to be able to cover. And yet, to many people, this is a story that is very difficult to engage with. It can feel overwhelming, it's very politicized, it can feel depressing, there's so much data to get to grips with. And yet, within this, there are some amazing and compelling human stories. And those are the stories that I set out to tell in this book with a real, I suppose, old-fashioned approach to journalism, getting on the ground, speaking to people, hearing their stories, and reporting them. It was a journey that ended up taking me 2 years through 26 countries on 6 different continents. I encountered some extraordinary people during that time, and I'd like to share just a few of their stories with you here today. So I'll share some of the photos that I took during my journey, and there are many more available on my website, simonmundy.com. This photograph, when people ask me which of the countries I went to was the most memorable, most extraordinary, I find myself talking about Mongolia. This gentleman here is a herder called Gombo. He lives in Uvs in the northwest of Mongolia, and he's been hit by one of the more surprising and counterintuitive climate impacts, which is extreme winter conditions. Herders in Mongolia have been hit by what they call dzud, which is extremely heavy snowfall, followed by extreme fluctuations in temperature that have been devastating their herds. This is linked to the accelerating melting of ice in the Arctic, which has been disrupting the movement of moisture and heat energy across the northern hemisphere. And we've seen similar instances of extreme weather in Europe and, of course, in Texas a couple of years ago. Climate change is a complicated thing, and we're playing a very dangerous game with our global climate system. In Ethiopia, I met another set of herders who are facing another very different set of challenges, again linked with climate change. Ali Mohammed on the left has seen his herd devastated by drought, followed by locust infestations, again all linked with changes to the regional climate. Gandli Galagosa here in the Solomon Islands, that's in the South Pacific to the far east of Australia. He is standing here on the site of his house, his former house, which has now been inundated by rising sea levels that have been rising at a pace even faster than the global average. This is a sign of what could await people in low-lying areas all over the world. In Bangladesh, you'll have heard lots about how Bangladesh is one of the most climate-vulnerable countries. People often talk about how parts of Bangladesh will end up being flooded and underwater, and this is true. But there is already an even more powerful change underway, which is the permeation of salty water into farmland across much of southwestern Bangladesh, where for centuries people have lived on rice farming. Now the earth is getting too salty, too saline to grow rice, and people like Morgina, who you see on the right here, who used to have a stable existence in a village in southwestern Bangladesh, now finds herself with her family in a slum area of Dhaka, which is an incredibly overcrowded city that's getting more and more overcrowded by the day. And all of these people, you might have noticed, have one thing in common. Well, 2 things, really, which is, for one thing, they are among the most vulnerable in terms of their economic resources. They're the least well-placed to resist these changes that they're being hit with. And at the same time, they have contributed the least to the global climate crisis. Per capita carbon emissions per year in the US is about 16 tons per person per year. In Ethiopia, 0.1, 160 times smaller. And so this comes down to a question of the two words that you see written on the placard in this photograph, which I took of Joana Sustento, a young Filipina climate activist, when she was holding a one-woman protest outside the Philippines headquarters of Shell, the oil company, in Manila. And she was arrested by the police and taken away. Fortunately, she was later released. And Joanna lost almost her entire family to the catastrophe of Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. They were among more than 6,000 people who were killed by that disaster in the Philippines. And the reason why she was protesting outside the office of Shell was because in the previous year, Shell had paid out more money in dividends to its shareholders than any other company in the world, $20 billion, much more than Apple, which was in second place. And its chief executive, Ben van Beurden, earned $62,000 per day. And the only reason why it was possible for Shell to give so much money to its shareholders and to its chief executive was because Shell has not been paying the cost of the pollution that is caused by the use of its products. That cost has been paid by people like Joanna's family and many other vulnerable communities all over the world. But it's too convenient, I think, to just point the finger at Shell, the producers and retailers of the fossil fuel products on which our economy relies. We also, as consumers of fossil fuels and of goods and services produced using fossil fuels, we are part of that system too. And what we have to talk about in response to this is a fundamental change in the way that the global economy works. And what's encouraging is that all over the world, everyone I spoke to realized that this has to happen, and moreover, it's already starting to happen. Even this guy. So this is Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman. He's the son of the king of Saudi Arabia and the energy minister of Saudi Arabia, which makes him effectively the most powerful person in the global energy business. And we had an interview which ended up lasting 3 hours because he was so keen to talk about the potential that Saudi Arabia saw in green energy. Now, I'm skeptical about that. I think we should all be skeptical about it. Saudi Arabia is by far the biggest exporter of oil today. Its economy rests upon that, and Prince Abdulaziz was open about the fact that Saudi Arabia intends to keep producing a lot of oil for a long time to come. But nonetheless, it was very interesting that he was so eager to say, we are not a fossil fuel dinosaur. We are getting on board with the clean energy revolution. We are going to be a leader in green hydrogen and solar. Whatever we think about Saudi Arabia and its energy policy, it's a really important sign that even Saudi Arabia now feels that publicly it has to talk very loudly about these things. That was not the case some years ago, and it's a sign of how fast momentum is starting to gather. That momentum is still not growing fast enough. We are still way off track from where we need to be in the decarbonization of the global economy. But I was excited by some of the innovations I saw being developed by a new generation of startup companies all over the world. I took this photo with my drone in Iceland. This is a place called Hellisheiði. It's Iceland's largest geothermal power plant. And this is where Edda Aradottir and her team are developing a project that's quite unlike any other I've seen in the world. She is the chief executive of an Icelandic company called Carbfix, and they have a joint venture with a Zurich-based company called Climeworks. And what they've built together is a system to suck carbon dioxide from the air, dissolve it in water, pump it underground, where it reacts with the Icelandic bedrock to form limestone. So whereas for hundreds of years we've been taking solid fossil fuels from under the ground, burning them, turning them into gas, which is heating our atmosphere, this is putting that into reverse. You take the gas, you turn it into a solid underground. So this seems exciting, but there's a hugely long way to go. They will need to rely on the carbon offset market, which at the moment is dominated by products that don't remove carbon from the atmosphere, but avoid emissions or reduce emissions. And the scale of what needs to happen is enormous. Each of the Climeworks machines removes 50 tons of carbon dioxide per year from the atmosphere. Global greenhouse gas emissions are more than 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And I said this to Christoph Gebald, who's one of Edda's partners. He's the co-chief executive of Climeworks. I said, you would need 1 billion of your machines to offset all of humanity's emissions. And he said, well, look, for one thing, we hope emissions will come down. Secondly, realistically, we don't expect to do it all on our own. But then he said a third thing, which I found really interesting. He said, Simon, do you realize that we as humanity make almost 100 million passenger cars every year? So if we wanted to make 100 million of our machines, which are actually smaller than a car and easier to make, it's not impossible. And that was just a sign for me of the scale and ambition with which some of these entrepreneurs are thinking. And if we as humanity become more ambitious as a whole, raise our sights, we could move an awful lot faster than we're doing. I met startups all over the world who are showing similar levels of ambitions. Didier Toubia is the chief executive of Aleph Farms, based in Israel, and they have created a way to grow steaks using bioreactors from cow cells. Now, this might sound pretty creepy and disgusting to many people. I'm sure a lot of people would not be comfortable with the idea of eating meat that comes from a bioreactor, but the fact is, cattle farming today, beef production, is one of the single biggest drivers of the climate crisis. It's driving deforestation, as I saw for myself in the Amazon rainforest, and the billion-plus cattle in the world today are an enormous source of methane. And these guys are among a growing number of alternative protein manufacturers who are trying to give consumers who love the taste of meat a planet-friendly way of doing that. In China, I met a really extraordinary mix of entrepreneurs. He Xiaopeng behind me, he became a billionaire in the Chinese e-commerce and digital economy. He developed the country's most popular web browser. He then went to work for Alibaba after selling his company to it. But he is one of a growing number of ambitious, high-powered Chinese entrepreneurs who reckon the place to be if you want to make billions in China is clean tech. So that's why he's now running an electric car company, XPeng Motors, one of China's biggest and most successful electric car companies. Now, a lot of people say with some justification, look, China is a huge part of the climate problem, and obviously that's true. China accounts for about 1/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's by far the single biggest emitter. But it is also true to say that China has a leading role in many of the key areas of the clean tech economy. Xiaopeng and other entrepreneurs that I met were absolutely convinced that this is the way to really align your business with the long-term strategy of the Chinese Communist Party, is to go for leadership in clean tech. And this is something where Europe and the US really have to make sure that they compete, because China is in a very, very strong position in many of these markets. And in the US, I saw a very different companies that were very impressive in a very different sort of way. Among them was the nuclear physicist Bob Mumgard, who you see in this photo. And what he's posing with in this photo is actually a very old nuclear fusion reactor. It was built in the 1980s, and when it was switched on, this was the hottest point in the entire solar system, 100 million degrees Celsius, 5 times hotter than the center of the sun. But the problem is that so far, no one has been able to build and develop a fusion reactor that can produce more energy than it consumes. So not much use as a working power station. Bob, since we met, has now raised $2 billion to build what he says will be the first working prototype of a fusion reactor that could deliver reliable, safe, zero-carbon, non-radioactive power, non-long-term radioactive power, which could transform the global energy sector. So just a few of the entrepreneurs who are really putting in place the building blocks for what could be a much cleaner world economy, and that's something which I think a lot of people underestimate. But I want to finish with the story of my trip to the Democratic Republic of Congo. I took this photograph in a place called Kolwezi, which is in the southeast of the country, and it's at the center of an extraordinary boom in mining for cobalt. I think I'm the only foreign journalist who's been stupid enough to go down inside an illegal Congolese cobalt mine, which is a scary place to be. But there are people like Mangovo, who you see here, holding cobalt in his hands. He spends all day, every day, down there. And there have also, sadly, been children like Letitia, who you see here, who have been working at mining sites in Congo. Now, and she's fortunately now training to be a seamstress with the help of an NGO, but many other children are still working in these places. And I want to finish with this story, because cobalt, for those who aren't familiar, cobalt is at the center of the clean tech economy. It's an essential ingredient in most electric car batteries today. And at the moment, most of the world's supply comes from Congo. And this raises some important questions for us. Some people might take a childish approach and say, see, let's not bother with electric vehicles. It's just as bad. Well, that's stupid. That's not the right answer. We need electric vehicles. The correct answer to this problem is to say, look, we have an opportunity here to do things differently. We have no choice but to move to cleaner forms of energy. That is being forced upon us by the climate catastrophe that we're heading towards. But it's not enough just to say, okay, well, we'll go for zero carbon options and just leave it at that. This is going to be difficult. This is going to be challenging. The answers are not always easy and obvious. But the beautiful thing is that we have an opportunity. As we are forced to move towards a lower carbon economy, we have an opportunity to build an economy that is truly better and fairer in every way for people like Letitia and billions of others in the global south, as well as lower carbon. So I'd like to leave it there. These are just a few of the stories that you'll find in the book. If you'd like to read more, it's on sale at the bookshop by the Blue Bubble, and I'll be signing copies there at 12 o'clock. I'll hope to see many of you there. Thank you.